talk about pathogens and disease just to keep our biology theme going along. So, first of all, just a bit of a recap. The little microorganisms that cause disease are called pathogens. So anything that can get in somewhere it shouldn't be and cause you harm is known as a pathogen. And we tend to group them into 4 main types. So you have the bacteria, fungi, protists. This is probably the one that people are least comfortable talking about. Protists are just simply single-celled, small, simple organisms, but they're small enough to infect us, and they can cause us some harm as well. And there's one particularly famous disease which is caused by protists, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then finally, very topical at the moment, we have viruses as well, obviously with coronavirus going on. So again, as well as having 4 main types that you kind of group together, you group a pathogen into being one of those types usually, you can kind of group a pathogen in terms of how it makes you ill, okay? So one of the ways, and this is predominantly bacteria, but not all bacteria do this. While going about their business, the pathogens will produce waste products in the same way that we do when we're doing respiration. And sometimes some of these waste products are poisonous, okay? So we call them toxins, and as the name suggests, they're toxic to us. So just by virtue of the fact that the pathogen is there, doing its whatever it is that it's doing, living its pathogen life, then it will produce these toxins just as a matter of course, and then these toxins can make us quite poorly, okay? So they can very often be poisons to the tissues and the enzymes, as it says there. Another way in which pathogens can cause illness, and here I'm thinking predominantly about viruses, but again, it can be caused by other types of pathogens doing this, is just by sheer weight of numbers, their reproduction, okay? So if we take viruses as an example, they make their way into your body. They will make their way into a cell and infect the cell. And that cell's obviously got all the kind of machinery that it needs to make copies of itself, to make more cells. But what the virus does is it hijacks that machinery, and it tricks the cell into making lots of copies of the virus instead of copies of itself, until the cell is full of these viruses, and so full, in fact, that very often it will burst. Then you've got a couple of problems then. You've got a dead, damaged cell, and you've got lots of viruses that go on to spread throughout the body and infect other cells and do the same thing again. So reproduction can cause illness because it damages the cells which is infected, and then obviously there's the knock-on effect of having more viruses floating around, infecting more cells, and therefore the whole thing continues. And then the other thing, which is wouldn't necessarily always associate with disease, but it can certainly be sore and make you feel unwell, is our own body's immune response. So when we're trying to fight an infection, a localized infection, so let's say it's, as the drawing here, just on the end of your finger, localized means it hasn't spread throughout the body. A systemic infection is one that's spread throughout the body. But if we take a localized infection as an example, you can very often see if a cut or a scratch or something is infected, because it will be swollen, it will be red, it will be sore to the touch. And these are all part of our immune response, because we're trying to send extra blood, and therefore extra white blood cells and extra platelets and all the rest of it, to the area where the infection is, to try and sort of seal it up and fight that infection. And another sign is you might sometimes see pus, which is like our white blood cells fighting the infection as well. They're all signs that you've got a localized infection in a cut or in a scratch, something like that. So as well as being able to group into different types and being able to be grouped into how they cause illness, pathogens can also be grouped in terms of how they are passed along, or how you pick them up and become infected by them. We call them transmission routes or transmission methods. So one way is you eat infected food or you drink infected water. So that could be because it's the pathogen has naturally got into the water supply or something like that. It could be because someone didn't cook their food properly, and the pathogen was living on or in the food, and it wasn't cooked properly or washed properly. But it makes its way into the body via ingestion, so being eaten or drank, and that's some way you can pick up an infection. Food poisoning is a common example of that, salmonella. Another way is you might pick up the infection because the pathogen is carried by a third organism, another organism. So you don't directly come into contact with another person who's infected, but something else might. So for example, we're looking at a mosquito and insect bite. They might bite someone who's infected, then they're kind of carrying the infection, then they might come and sort of bite you, and they might give you the infection. So whenever that happens, whenever there's an organism involved which carries the infection and passes it on, we call that vector transmission. So in this example, the mosquito is known as a vector. And then this is, again, quite topical given what we're seeing with the coronavirus pandemic, airborne droplets. That tends to come about due to coughing and sneezing. And we're not talking about, big blobs of saliva flying around everywhere, although they would infect you. We're talking about tiny droplets here that will stay pretty much float suspended in the air, and they can stay there for quite a while depending on whether you're inside or outside, or how close you are to someone, or whether they've got a mask on. They can all change your chances of picking up the pathogen via that method. Another one's direct contact. I mean, in the diagram there, it's got a baby who will obviously be picking up the infection from the mother, from the direct contact with the mother, but it doesn't have to happen like that. This just means direct contact with an infected person. So you might touch somebody who has a pathogen on them and you pick it up directly from them. It might be that it's through sharing of bodily fluids. So I'm thinking of sexually transmitted disease there. That's an example of direct contact. But then the one which is slightly less obvious, but just as dangerous, is indirect contact. So this is the reason why we disinfect all our door handles. We're spraying down the surfaces. Everyone's using hand sanitizer. Because you or I might be infected, we might not even know, we might not show any symptoms. We might cough on our hand, for example, then go and use the door handle. Somebody else doesn't have to come into contact with me, but they could then use the same door handle. They could pick up the pathogen that way. They can become infected. They didn't have to come anywhere near the infected person, but they touched or used an object that was carrying the pathogen and they picked it up that way. And that's known as indirect contact transmission. All right, so again, this is a recap. I just want to make sure we've got this clear. Communicable diseases are those which you can catch by becoming infected. So they're caused by pathogens. So the ways in which we've spoken about so far, we're only referring about communicable diseases, okay, ones that you can catch effectively. Non-communicable diseases, which we'll look at a couple of those examples in a minute, they're the ones which you can't catch. So you can develop them, and there are things that you can do in your life that will give you a greater or lesser chance of getting those diseases, but you don't catch those diseases off somebody else, okay? So those are non-communicable diseases. So sometimes you might be born with them. I'm thinking genetic diseases there. Sometimes you can develop them over time depending on how you live your life. But however you get them, you didn't catch them off somebody. So here is a communicable disease. And this is when I said, we're going to look at an example of one caused by a protist, so a small single-celled organism. That's this. So the mosquito, as you can see there, is the vector. It's not the thing that's, it's not a pathogen itself. It's carrying in its blood that it's sucked from somebody who's got malaria, sucks up some of their blood. The blood's got the little protist in it, the little single-celled organisms. They then fly around, they bite somebody else. And as they bite somebody else, they inject their mouthpiece into them. They almost like backwash the protist into the person who wasn't infected, and they become infected. Okay, so the mosquito isn't ill. The mosquito acts as a vector. So bites an infected person, flies away, bites someone who isn't infected, and infects them with the single-celled organism that causes malaria. Okay, so they act as a vector. They suck blood from an infected person, and they take the protist with them that causes malaria, and then they fly somebody else and they bite them. And as we say, they're acting like a vector. So how could you stop the spread of malaria? Well, here we have what's called a mosquito nest. Basically, if a mosquito can't bite you, you can't get malaria. Okay, so a mosquito net is designed to keep mosquitoes out, so that even if they were infected mosquitoes flying around that net, they can't get through the net, and then they can't get to you, and then they can't bite you, and therefore they can't give you mosquito. It provides a barrier. Okay. Cholera. Cholera is an example of a disease caused by a bacteria. Okay, Vibrio cholerae, and it's characterized by having really, really, really bad diarrhea. Okay, and eventually the problems that you get with cholera are normally due to dehydration because you lose so much fluid. Okay, in order to get it though, you have to have eaten infected food or drank infected water that, rather disgustingly, has been infected with the cholera bacteria. Now, where does the cholera bacteria come from? It comes from the watery diarrhea. So you're drinking water which has been infected with the bacteria. The water will have had feces in it, or someone has been in contact with feces and they've touched food and you've eaten that. Okay, but that's the way in which